Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of instructive chess videos. We're going to go back to an amateur game today. It's amazing, I noticed that sometimes the amateur games get less views than some of my other videos, and that really shouldn't be so, because if it's a well-annotated game and if it features interesting ideas that you can learn from, you certainly should want to watch it. It's going to be instructive. And of course, as I've mentioned many times, amateur games sometimes features errors that you wouldn't see in Grandmaster games, but they're the kind of errors that my viewers might make or my viewers' opponents might make. So it certainly makes sense to learn from them, to not only how to avoid them, but also how to exploit them. Today's video, though, the game is really interesting and the quality of play is pretty good. So if you think this game is less interesting than a Grandmaster game, well, I would tend to disagree. Grandmaster games can be, of course, wonderfully fascinating, but so can amateur games. And they could both be really dull, too. This one's not. All right, so in the game, white played d4. Black played knight f6 and Indian defense, or at least starting out as one. White plays knight f3, kind of a non-committal move. Black plays e6 and says, white, if you want to play c4, I can play b6 with a queen's Indian, or bishop b4 check with a bogo Indian, or maybe d5 with the queen's gambit declined. White says, no, I'm going to play a Tory attack, bishop to g5. What's the difference between a Tory attack and a Trompovsky? In a Tory attack, you're bringing the knight to f3 first and then bishop g5. In a Trompovsky, you play bishop g5 right away. Okay, black plays his break move, c5, very typical move in this position. White reinforces the center with e3. Now that his bishop's out, he's not blocking it, getting ready to develop his king bishop. Black develops his bishop to e7. White plays knight bd2. White could have just played bishop d3 or bishop e2 and castles here. Black plays b6, getting ready to fianchetto the bishop. If white plays bishop d3 and castles now, for instance, bishop d3, castle, castle. Black has the option here of playing like bishop to a6, trying to pin this bishop to the rook and trade off his bishop. But of course, that's not a bad bishop for black. He can always play it to b7. So white plays bishop d3, and black just says, I'll just play bishop b7, puts it on the long diagonal. You know, both sides are playing very reasonably. When that happens, we would expect white to have a slight opening advantage. When both sides play reasonably, white gets a slight advantage from having the first move. And here, white's advantage, according to Stockfish, is about a third of a pawn. White plays c3. Stockfish says it was a little more accurate to play h3. Don't ask me why. Black castles. Again, Stockfish likes h3. I guess in some lines he wants to be able to tuck the bishop away. White plays queen e2. Well, that stops bishop a6, but of course black wasn't going to play bishop a6 anyway. Once he played bishop to b7, but the queen on e2 is not a bad square, and later on white can expand in the center with e4. Notice if we look at the times, white is playing a little bit slower than black. Black's playing pretty fast, but black's playing pretty normal moves. So the time management for both sides is okay here. Black plays knight c6. White castles kingside. Computer actually thought that maybe white should consider starting a kingside attack already with h4. Interesting. Okay, so white castles kingside, more normal. Black plays c takes d. No reason really to do that. If white takes with the e pawn, he only has one center pawn. If he takes with the c pawn, black could consider playing knight to b4, and if the bishop moves, then he could play bishop to a6. So white decides to play e takes, and black plays knight d5, offering the trade of the bishops. Computer says that's about as good as anything, and again, white retains, you know, a minimal opening advantage here. White plays his best move, bishop takes. And now Stockfish likes knight c takes e7, repositioning that knight toward the king side. Black plays the more, well, no, black does play that move, excuse me. Takes with that knight. And now Stockfish likes g3 to prevent the knight to f4. Humans are reluctant to do that. They don't want to weaken the white squares when the bishop's on the long diagonal, and we can understand that. White plays queen e4, threatening queen h7 mate, and it's not that he doesn't want, that he's thinking black won't see that and he's going to mate him. What he wants to do is pin the knight on d5 to the bishop on b7 so the knight can't go to f6, and force black to make some sort of pawn move on the king side to possibly weaken the position. So black is actually not weakening the position, and black plays his best move, f5. So white is getting what he wants here, but what he wants isn't really that good. White continues with his kingside aggression with queen to h4, and now black finds the absolute best idea. Black's rated 40 points lower than white here, but his play on the next few moves is really quite nice. He plays rook f6, the number one move in the position. And now he's threatening to play maybe rook h6 or rook g6, and that bishop on b7 combined with the rook are going to start to create some real threats, and the queen could get awkward on the king side, the queen on h4. Stockfish suggests white's best move is rook f e1 with a big advantage to black. White plays knight to c4, keeping an eye on e5 and d6. The problem is that his queen's almost trapped here. For instance, here black could play knight g6, and if queen g3, he can play knight df4, hitting the bishop. And if white tries to save the bishop, he has knight e2 check, winning the queen. So white's in big trouble here if black finds this line, which he didn't, but the line he found was pretty good also. He plays rook h6. White plays queen g5. And now Stockfish says black should play queen to c7, threatening not to take the pawn right away, but to tie down the knight to guarding the pawn, and then black can just move this knight on d5 anywhere and threaten bishop takes knight, removing the guard with mate. Instead, black plays rook g6, focusing on g2. Stockfish says white should play queen to c1, with a nice advantage for black, but not nearly as big as it would have been on queen c7. White plays queen d2, but on queen d2, black can capture on c3 and then take on f3. If white had played queen to c1 and black plays knight c3, and white now plays knight ce5 hitting the rook, this knight is hanging and the rook, and white would be okay. On queen d2, doesn't quite work that way. So black plays d6 first. If he had played knight c3, again white should play knight ce5, and the computer suggests black should counter with knight e4 hitting the queen with about an equal game. All right, back to the main line. Black plays d6. That stops the knight from going to d6. It stops either knight from going to e5. And now knight takes c3 is a real threat. The computer suggests white's best move is g3, with the idea that if knight takes c3, white can play knight h4, again hitting the knight and hitting the rook. White plays rook a e1, and now black plays knight takes c3, but it still doesn't work for the same reason. He's thinking if I take there that he gets a free pawn because bishop takes f3 as a threat. But what he misses is that white can just play knight h4 hitting the rook. And if the rook counters by hitting the knight, then when white takes the knight and the rook takes, white can play rook takes e6 and get his pawn back, and black's position is starting to crumble a little in the center. Unfortunately for white, he misses this idea. He doesn't play knight h4, he plays pawn takes, and that's an amateur mistake because knight h4 just had to be played. And now after bishop f3, black not only wins a pawn, but he gets a very nice kingside attack. So white plays g3 to save the pawn. Black plays knight d5. And now black's actually threatening to play queen h4 and take advantage of the sneaky pin, what Charles Hertan calls the sneaky pin, He's not attacking the pinned g3 pawn. He's just simply going to the square it's not really guarding. And white needs to do something about this. White plays knight to b2. Not his best move. Stockfish suggests... Well, Stockfish says bishop e2 and knight b2 are about equally good. So knight b2. Notice both sides are starting to get in some time trouble here. But they do have a 45-second increment. So later on when they have less time, they're still going to be able to make moves with an extra 45 seconds added each move. So black plays queen h4, and if we look at his clock, he used about 3 minutes to make that move. White goes after the bishop. Stockfish says the best move for black is to take it, but instead black comes up with a clever idea that's not quite as good. He plays queen to h3, and now white's next couple moves are forced, so he's bound to find it as long as his clock doesn't fall. He takes the bishop to stop the mate. What else could he do? And black plays rook h6, threatens queen takes h2 mate. Do you see the only way that white can stop the mate? And the answer is he only has one move. Queen takes h6, and he played it in 19 seconds. So he must have seen this either on the move before, or he realized this was the only move that didn't get mated. So he takes there. And when black takes back with the queen to guard the e-pawn, white now pins the knight to the rook. So he's not only getting the rook and the bishop for the queen, but he's also going to get a knight for a pawn, which means that from a material standpoint, white's doing quite okay. The problem is his rook on f1 is blocked out of the game, his knight on b2 is awkward, and the bishop on f3 is hanging. So black has a chance here to harass those pieces and hold on. So black can also just give up the exchange here. What he can do is just play knight c7 to guard the rook, and if bishop takes, knight takes, he'll have a queen against the two rooks. Black will also have an extra pawn, and black will be doing quite well here. Instead, black decides to counterattack the knight. The problem with that is white can now attack the queen and guard the knight, or he can even play a combination. He can play rook takes e6, and if queen takes b2 and bishop takes d5, black's got big problems because of the discovery. So turns out rook takes e6 is the best move here. White takes a couple minutes and plays rook e2, pretty much forcing black to play queen takes d4. And now white can, again, win the knight for the pawn, but this isn't quite as good as, well, it's not nearly as good as the other line. This is why basic tactics are usually deciding the game. And of course, if you get low on time, it's hard to find, if you have multiple tactics, it's hard to compare them and figure out which one is the best. But here, this line turns out to be equal, while both sides had chances to do much better. So black plays e5, and now white should grab the open file with rook to c2. White plays rook to d1 because he's worried that black's going to remove the guard on the d-pawn. So he plays this move first, but it really doesn't do that much. Queen to c3. White attacks the queen again. Queen checks. Stockfish thinks queen a5 is slightly better, but black's down to 3 minutes. So he's just trying to get in a couple quick moves and save his time. White attacks the queen again, basically offering a draw. Black says, no thank you. Queen c5. Stockfish says, yeah, black, you have a slight advantage. If you want to play for a win, that's fine. White plays bishop g2. He has nothing better. Here, black should grab that open file, finally get the rook in the game with rook c8. He plays e4 to remove the bishop from guarding the d-pawn, but he could always have done that later. The d-pawn was not in any trouble, so getting the rook in the game made more sense. All right, so black plays e4, and white plays rook on 1 to d2. So he's got all his pieces guarded. His back rank is a little bit weak, but in this line, he can't play rook to c2 without losing the d-pawn. Of course, if black plays rook to c8, he could win the queen for 2 rooks, or that's not actually winning it. He would give up the queen for 2 rooks if he skewers the queen, but then queen takes c2, and that rook is a monster on the queen side in that endgame. So black plays a5, and white plays h4, giving his king an extra square. Black plays b5. Notice black has a 2-on-1 majority on the queen side. So black says, rather than develop my rook, why don't I push the pawns in front of the rook, and that gets my rook into the game. Of course, if black can create another passed pawn here, that would be very, very helpful. And both sides are pretty much moving on their increment at this point. White has 4 minutes left, black has 2. White makes king h2, and that move he made in like 14 seconds. So he gained some time on the clock, which is a good idea generally when you're low like this. Black plays a4. Stockfish now suggests white should try to get his knight back in the game with knight d1 and then be able to come up to e3 or somewhere. Because right now this knight has pretty much no future with the way the black pawns are. So he needs to get that knight to a much more active square. So white attacks the pawn on f5 with bishop h3. And black first attacks the knight, but that doesn't make a lot of sense. The knight is very poorly placed on b2. It's much better on d1, and the pawn on a3 is not going anywhere. So playing a3 is not a good idea. Black should just guard his f-pawn with g6 and tie up the white pieces. Playing a3 almost forces white to do what he hadn't been doing, which is get his knight onto a better square back into the game. You never want to force your opponent to make good moves. So white plays knight to d1, of course. It's his only safe knight move. He could attack the queen first, but then he would lose the pawn. Black now guards his f-pawn with f5. And now white plays knight e3, guarding the d-pawn, so his rook is free to move to the open file. Black plays rook to f8. I'm not sure if he's looking to break with f5 here. I wouldn't think so. That would just open up the bishop and let the knight do good things. So I'm not sure what rook f8 does. Stockfish now suggests that if white plays rook c2, it's 0-0-0, equal game. And he does find the best move. The suggestion is black should play queen d4. This is a pretty interesting game. It's got imbalances. If we look at the material, both sides have a rook. Both sides have at least 5 pawns. But after that, white has a rook, a bishop, and a knight for a queen and 2 pawns. So that's a pretty interesting imbalance. Generally, you'd rather have the rook, the knight, and the bishop than the queen and the 2 pawns. But here the pawns are pretty strong. The bishop on h3 is a little out of the game. And, you know, black's queen is pretty active. So all in all, it adds up to an equal game with an interesting endgame coming up. And both sides, again, are short on time. Anybody can win. Bet on the player who's the better speed player. Okay, so it's white's move. White plays rook to the 7th. Black says, okay, I'll block you off before your other pieces come down and help. White says, well, let's gain some time on the clock with a check. Black says, I'll still trade rooks even if I have to recapture on f8. White says, I'll gain some time too, although on that last move he thought about it for almost 2 minutes and played rook c7. Black immediately plays rook f7, says, thanks for the time. White checks again. Would you like a draw? Black says, no, I don't. King here. Now, black has to be careful. If he moves the rook off the f-file, white can play bishop takes f5 with the idea that if g takes f5, knight takes f5, check forks the king and the queen. So black's pieces are a little bit geometrically challenged here. White plays rook there. In some lines, maybe he can try to get rid of that rook so he can play bishop takes f5. Black plays b4 and says, maybe in some lines I can even sack that pawn and get my pawn rolling. He has a 2-on-1 majority, but he has a backward b-pawn here. But it's not a really terribly backward pawn because it might be easily helped up or it might be able to be sacrificed to get a passed pawn. So white forks the queen and the b-pawn, and black goes back and guards his b-pawn. And white says, let me hit the queen and hit the d-pawn. Stockfish suggests black should play queen a5. Black says, I'll just go back to the 7th rank. So what happens now if the rook takes the pawn? Well, if the rook takes the pawn, black can play queen to a7. Interesting move. Maybe threatening b3 and pushing the a pawn. So in the game, White played h5, went for a break on the king side. And of course, he's hoping black will move that pawn so he can take on f5. Black says, all right, here's my sacrifice. Well, it's not even a sacrifice. It's guarded by the queen. But he's willing to give up the d pawn to get that passed a pawn. Again, Stockfish says if white plays perfectly here, by taking that pawn and then taking the pawn on d6, he should be able to still get a draw. He takes the pawn, black takes, and white goes back. Computer says better is to play rook takes, and if a2, then pawn takes. If a1 queen, knight checks. If rook takes, rook checks. King takes. Bishop checks. King takes. Oh, this is an amazing line. I didn't see this when I was going over the game the first time. Rook f5 check. King g6. And black's winning. Okay, so why wouldn't he do that? Did I make a wrong move here? Rook takes f5. Rook c7 check. No. It's interesting. Computer says that white is winning. Rook c7 check. Okay. Rook d7 check. I hit the wrong rook. There's the winning move. Rook checks. King h6. Pawn checks. King h5. Pawn checks. King g5. Pawn 8. Queen check. And white wins. Wow. I wouldn't have seen that in a million years, much less in time trouble. Really beautiful line. Wow. Okay, so the computer just found an amazing line there that he could let black queen the pawn with all his threats on the king side. So understandably, white didn't see that. I wouldn't have seen that. I don't think too many grandmasters would have seen that. Rook back, if they would have, hats off to them. Queen to b4, black's down to a minute 22, which means before he made that move, his clock, he just got 45 seconds added to his clock. So he had 82, he got 45, so he was already down to 37 seconds when he made that move. Queen b4, rook c4. White's happy to get a draw with that dangerous a pawn. Black says, you can't attack my queen if I go to b5. That's true, but the engine says queen a5, threatening to push the pawn is better. White plays his best move, rook a2, and now black's advantage has shrunk to about half a pawn. Black guards the pawn with the rook. White gets the bishop into the game. Engine suggests queen b1 hitting the rook. Black finds it. White has nothing better than to guard the rook. Black plays rook a5. Engine suggests king f6 might win. White guards overprotects the bishop with king g2 so his knight can move. Black says, would you like to trade a pair of rooks so my a-pawn can go in? Computer says rook takes rook is the best white has. And white completely blunders with rook takes a3. So what did white miss? Well, on rook takes, black has two ways to take a rook. He can take on a2. He can take on c5. Suppose he takes on a2. Then rook a5, rooks belong behind passed pawns. If now the queen moves to something like b2, then knight c4 forks the queen and the pawn. If the queen goes to b3 to stop that, rook a6. And of course, if a2, then bishop c4. And again, he gets the pawn through a trick. So that doesn't work. White can hold the game that way. Suppose black takes this rook. Then white can simply take the dangerous pawn, and white's actually winning now. So white had to take the rook. Rook takes c5. Right now, black is threatening rook takes c2, and if rook takes c2, then he plays a2. If he plays knight takes c2, then queen takes a2. So black has a big threat to play rook takes c2, and the only move is rook c5. So in a sense, this is the biggest mistake of the game here for white. Let's see how much time he took. He played that move relatively quickly. He made that move in less than the increment. His clock went up 5 seconds. But he's just giving up a knight for nothing here. And that he can't do. Rook takes c2, and now the game's over. The rest really doesn't need a whole ton of comment. Knight takes c2, so it was a great battle for a long time until that move. Rook checks, king up, pawn takes, hopeless endgame. Black has a queen and a pawn versus a rook and a bishop. That's way too much. Now black can play e3, take advantage of the pin of the pawn. He misses it, attacks the d-pawn instead. White gives a nice spite check, attacks the d-pawn. Black says, thanks for another pawn. Resigns is good. Rook checks, king toward the middle, king g1, queen hits the rook, rook d8, here comes the passed pawns, d5, rook b8, d4, again resigns is good. Rook b2 was a great game until recently. Now, white's just not resigning because black's a little low on time, but black's gaining time with every move. d2, bishop e2, queen e1, and now the bishop has to leave the square. There's no way to guard the bishop, and the bishop can't stand that diagonal, so the computer says black has mate in 11. So until a few moves ago, it was a very competitive and interesting game. All white needed to do, I shouldn't say all he needed to do because it wasn't that easy, but on rook c5, he had to take the rook, and he would be able to hold the game. Once he gave up the piece for the pawn with this maneuver, this is quite a hopeless endgame. Okay, well, that was a good game. Thanks for sending it in to me. If you want to send me a game, you don't have to send an attachment. Just print out the moves on an email. Go to my website, danheisman.com. You can send me the game. I don't use every game that I'm sent. I do use a fair percentage of them, but not every game. Better is if it's a slow game. If you send me a speed game, I'm less likely to use it. You don't have to send me any annotations or notes. That's quite okay. All right, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. It was a really interesting game. I thought it was interesting. Hope you will too. Okay, talk to you next time. Thanks. Bye.